want to talk to you about literary analysis, which, of course, we can discuss more in depth during our Collaborate session tomorrow. But I wanted to just sort of give you an overview of what exactly literary analysis entails, um, and kind of what the structure for an essay would look like, without getting into any of the specifics of the actual assignment that you guys are going to do, but just kind of going over the basics. All right, so a literary analysis can refer to a lot of different types of text, right? So fiction, poetry, drama, and it explains these works by means of interpretation, right? So the goal of a literary analysis is to broaden and deepen your reader's understanding of a work of literature. Okay, and so again, this is based on your personal interpretation, right? So analysis is very subjective. An interpretation is an individual response that addresses meaning, right? So an interpretation might discuss an overarching theme or motif, or it might discuss more intricate details within a text. A strong interpretation often does both, right? And we'll talk more about that in terms of what the content of your literary analysis would look like, what kind of aspects of a text you want to focus on. Okay, so for example, I'm going to show you guys what interpretations might look like. Okay, so in Robert Frost's Fire and Ice, Frost uses opposite images to convey the different ways in which society seems compelled to self-destruct. Okay, and these are just, for these examples, it doesn't matter if you haven't read the work. It's just examples of the way that you could interpret different types of literature. Okay, another example in Honey My Love, Sterling Brown vacillates between vernacular and formal language in order to send a message about the relationship between wealth and happiness. In A Slave Among Slaves, Booker T. Washington employs symbolism through references to a schoolhouse and ginger cakes, both of which were off limits to slaves, to convey his personal aspirations. And that's one that we did talk about in class. All right, so remember that interpretation is often subjective and often up for debate, right? So your interpretation doesn't need to be right, it just needs to be supported by evidence, right? So you have to make your thought process clear to your reader so they can understand how you came to your conclusion. In other words, analysis is really in the eye of the beholder, right? So whatever you take from a text is completely valid so long as you explain it. All right. So people who read, 10 people might read the same poem and have 10 completely different interpretations of it, and that's totally fine. That's what makes literary analysis fun, is that, everyone kind of gets to have their own take. All right, so how do you prove your interpretation? You prove it by finding a pattern of examples in the text that supports your idea. You find this in the literary elements such as plot, point of view, character, setting, stylistic devices, tone, and style. In other words, you look at all of the different literary elements that are at work in order to find examples and proof of your analysis, right? So if you decide that a poem has a particular theme, you want to really examine all of the different parts of that poem to explain why you believe the theme is what it is, right? And that means looking at the characters used, looking at where the poem is set, looking at the different forms of symbolism, looking at all of the literary devices that are used. So really examining all the different parts of the writing in order to explain your interpretation. If interpretations are an individual response, are all interpretations valid? Yes and no. In other words, it depends, right? So because an interpretation must be supported, the strength or weakness rests on the strength or weakness of your evidence and argument, right? So short answer would be yes, all interpretations are valid. Longer answer is they're valid so long as you can prove them. Okay, so you can make as wild a claim as you want in a literary analysis, so long as you can back it up with evidence. So you have to organize a discussion that convinces the reader that your point of view is astute, that your point of view is correct, right? It's not enough to just identify a theme or symbol or significant moment. You have to then explain the deeper meaning within the work, why it's important, what it reveals, right? So a literary analysis is not saying this is a metaphor, this is a simile. It's identifying those literary devices and then explaining why they're important, how they're operating, why they contribute to the message of that work. Okay, so the previous examples that I showed you guys, those interpretations, they're not analyses, right? They just introduce my interpretation. They do not prove my point. Okay, so to go back to those, Sterling Brown vacillates between vernacular and formal language in order to send a message about the relationship between wealth and happiness. Okay, so that's an interpretation, but it doesn't mean that my reader knows what I'm talking about or believes what I'm saying. So that's where I have to analyze. That's where I have to take this interpretation that I have identified and explain my reasoning. Okay, it's not an analysis unless I do that. So, if I wanted to take those three interpretations that I gave as examples earlier and then analyze them, in other words, explain those interpretations, I would have to go deeper. So, for example, Frost first portrays fire as a symbol for humanity's greed and passion, both of which are destructive forces. He then examines the opposite, the idea of ice as a symbol for passivity, hostility, and inaction, suggesting these two can operate in destructive ways. Okay, so this is starting to be an analysis, right? Obviously, there's a lot more to be said, but I'm explaining, okay, I've identified these as symbols of destruction. Now I'm starting to explain why they're symbols of destruction. The speaker in Honey My Love transitions from using sophisticated language to describe his misery into colloquial language, right? So more casual conversational language to describe his sudden optimism. This profound shift happens as a result of him hearing music being played by a poor busker on the street, suggesting that the speaker's status has brought him no true happiness and the poor man is perhaps the more content of the two. So in my interpretation, all I really said was that the different language that he uses shows the relationship between wealth and happiness. So I'm introducing my interpretation. Now I'm starting to analyze that, right? The fact that when he uses the fancier language,